welcome to Show Studio. It's our second live panel discussion of Milan Fashion Week, and we're talking about the show that everyone kind of looks to Milan for, which is Prada. But it's actually quite exciting because Prada's got a bit of competition now, because there's lots of exciting sort of changes and developments going on at Milan Fashion Week, particularly with the new Gucci designer Alessandro Michele, who showed yesterday. There's several topics I want to talk about in relation to Prada, sort of as well as the show, which we're going to see shortly. One of which is gender, which does really relate actually to what we saw at Gucci yesterday. It's also very pertinent to Prada. You know, at the last menswear show, Mrs. Prada gave a sort of a manifesto about how she sees fashion and gender sort of relating to each other, and she stylishly kind of put men on her womenswear runway and women on her menswear runway, and some would call that just a commercial decision, but we'll discuss what we think of that later. I also want to talk a little bit about sales and about the Chinese market, because obviously we've seen some interesting sales figures from Prada recently, and I think it's interesting to talk about the luxury market in China and how brands like Prada need to deal with that smartly and intelligently. We're also in a slightly more fun discussion where we can use our imagination a bit. We're going to talk about, you know, who could replace Mrs. Prada in her position. Dare we even talk about that? Because it's something that people rarely discuss, but I think something that is interesting to think about, given that, you know, we have a lot of designers who are at the forefront of fashion who are relatively old, and it's always interesting to think about who could come in and sort of keep the houses going. But before we kick off all those discussions, I'll let my amazing set of panellists from all across the industry just introduce themselves, starting with you.
I'm Sonnet Stanfill, fashion curator at the V&A.
I'm Roger Tredre from Central St Martins and Stylist.com.
I'm William Oliver, writer and editor.
I'm Butchart, I'm an associate lecturer at London College of Fashion.
Oriole Cullen, I'm also fashion curator at the V&A.
And it's a V&A heavy panel.
It is.
It's good, I like it. So as I said, I kind of want to kick off with a slight discussion about gender, and I think it's really pertinent given the men's show that we're seeing here. I don't know if everyone had a look at the menswear show, but, you know, I'm calling it a menswear show, but it really wasn't. You know, nearly half the looks were women's wear looks. You know, I actually counted, and I think it was like 28 out of like 52 looks or something like that. So it really, really was very heavy on the women's wear. And also, particularly interestingly, the most striking look in the collection, which was that colourful check coat, was worn by a woman. The rest of the collection was sort of black and grey. And lots of grumbling GQ editors at that show, really not happy to have to sit through all of that. But also she left an amazing manifesto on the seat, which is notable in itself because she never does show notes, that talked about, you know, Prada's analysis of the relationship between men and women. She said, what are the unexpected possibilities, the various relationships that may occur between the way men and women can or would dress, the way they represent themselves. This is a subject always under investigation. Why does the time feel right for a sort of redressing of gender within fashion? You're nodding, so I'm going to go to you first.
Well, I just think it's interesting that we've come to this point with Prada because a few years ago, you know, I interviewed her and I asked her the question, do you see your shows as, do you envision men and women as a Prada couple walking down the road together? And she said that she saw them as separate entities, but that they influence each other. But it seems that, you know, she's obviously moved towards a convergence. And if you look at the looks on the catwalk of the menswear show, there is a kind of convergence in aesthetic, with the exception of that one bright coat. So I just I think that one has to allow for an evolution in a designer's way of thinking.
Absolutely.
And, you know, she's definitely shown that with the notes and with her kind of manifesto, as you say.
It's interesting though that she said she sees them as quite separate, because one of the things I found most striking about this show is, even though it was very much about gender, it wasn't androgynous. You know, and the palette was similar, as you say, across the men and the women's, but the women's looks were, you know, very definitely feminine. You know, the dresses, there were sort of big, even like, it's hard with the front on images, but from the back, a lot of them were backless, a lot of flesh, a lot of bows. They were almost quite deliberately feminine, and I found that quite interesting.
I think quite a lot of fashion houses have tried from the very starting point in the design studio of looking at the colour palette particularly. Obviously, there's subtle differences or not so subtle differences, but the core colour palette has often been worked over together. And I think the experience of the fashion houses I've worked with in more detail have gone both ways. You know, they've had periods when they brought it quite close together. It depends on the creative director who's in charge and to what extent that person feels that they've got a vision that they can stretch across men's and women's. Should
we be quite cynical though? Does it just come down to kind of store merchandising and what's going to sit well together? And, you know, is it?
No, not at all. I think you know, in the perfect world, it would be wonderful if there was a creative director across men's and women's, as there is clearly at Prada, with a cohesive vision that is genderless, and that's very special and wonderful when it happens. But some houses haven't evolved that way, and sometimes it's just by, in my view, in my experience, just by chance really that they haven't got the creative director who perhaps either gets menswear or womenswear, and they've found it better to work with two separate entities.
What's your take on it, Oriole? Do you think people increasingly are wanting genderless fashion?
I think it's interesting because at the moment menswear is fashionable. You know, it's a very fashionable topic, and you know, with the expansion of the calendar, I think that's another thing to look at. How far can we go? Because obviously London has now cemented its menswear season, you know, and it's only a matter of time before all the other cities have that. So eventually, are you just going to end up on a plane all year round? So from a practical point of view alone, I think it does make sense in a way to show them together, and maybe that's the direction we're heading in. Of course, you know, what that means in terms of scale, to get all of the womenswear buyers, all the menswear buyers there is
what if that role of buying and merchandising were also merged? I was thinking about that this morning, that why, you know, if a designer can do all, why couldn't a merchandiser take on that? Because then from the customer's point of view, there would be an aesthetic that's kind of unified and similar too.
And I do think there are brands that prove that there are, you know, I'm not going to say that everyone is dressing in a gender neutral fashion, but I do think there are signs that women are happy to wear clothes that are also not just androgynous clothes, like share their wardrobes. And I just, it feels quite antiquated, this notion that, you know, a designer has one vision for a woman and a different vision for a man, and you know, and that, as you say, extends down to how things are merchandised. What do you guys
I was
think?
just going to say, I think there's a social shift as well. I think that there's a social shift to do with, I mean, transgender is becoming, you know, the most kind of talked about issue when it comes to sexuality. You've got Selfridges with their kind of floor of mixed male and female, and like kind of gender neutral fashion as well. So I mean, I do feel it's a wider kind of shift, you know, it's got more than just within the idea of merchandising or a commercial aspect.
Yeah.
And I think Time did one of their famous covers last year where they sort of said transgender tipping point, and they made a big thing of it, and there are statistics that show that it's a significant minority within the North American population. 2 to 5% of people could be defined as transgender, which means there's a commercial market there as well.
Yeah, that's interesting.
So it's not just a social thing, although I completely agree with William that there's a strong element to that, but there is also recognition that this is an underserved market.
Yeah.
I feel like fashion has been playing with sort of concepts of gender for a few years as well, though. Like you say, is it timely? I think it does feel quite timely with things like J.W. Anderson trying to create, you know, a few years ago, sort of this idea of genderless clothing. And even in terms of castings on the runway, you know, using sort of women for menswear shows, specifically wearing sort of menswear. I do think that it's something that is, a social shift, and something that fashion is very heavily sort of picking up on at the moment.
I think it's interesting that you cite J.W. Anderson, because I do agree, you know, his fashion is kind of almost genderless, and he makes, you know, he'll put boys in frills and then he'll put girls in kind of quite shapeless things. I think what I found so striking about that menswear show was the fact that she put show notes down that talked all about gender, and I know I'm kind of almost repeating myself a bit, but it's not androgynous. You know, there's no, the girls look like girls and the boys look like boys, and I know it sounds strange to say that that's kind of a more progressive way of treating gender, but I feel like androgyny almost feels a bit tired, and everyone's like, you know, okay, great, a girl in boyfriend jean and an oversized jacket, and I think I found that interesting, that to her this was so about gender, but she'd kept their wardrobe so distinct. And it feels quite separate from the explorations of gender that we've seen with designers like J.W. Anderson. I don't know, does no one agree? I'm not sure.
I wonder if that sort of sounds like it is a commercial idea then.
Yeah.
You know, if you are doing women's wear and menswear, but you're putting them together on the runway for one audience, you know, who's buying, who are you selling to? So maybe it is a kind of commercial and maybe a merchandising.
An interesting case study is Hugo Boss, the ultimate menswear company, and when they launched Boss Woman in about 2000, I think. I mean, what were they going to do? And that was, what a perfect opportunity to produce a kind of collection that came out of menswear, and that a genderless kind of statement there. And in a way, they did that. And it didn't really work for them.
Yeah.
They had a disastrous first few seasons, and they're still struggling now under Jason Wu running the womenswear to define it. But most of the reviews, interestingly, at the New York show were saying, could we have less of the tailoring and more of the softer, traditionally feminine style? So this was a company that could have produced that, but the market found that too extreme if they stuck too severely to tailoring.
And sorry, what were you going to
No,
say?
I was just going to say it's interesting in contrast to Gucci, because of course that was quite beautifully androgynous. I thought, you weren't sure if it was a boy or girl initially coming down the runway, which I think worked, quite seamlessly.
Yeah.
But as you say, all the girls here are wearing skirts, and so again, it's almost she is making that point.
But I think it's kind of the way I was thinking about it, and I suppose not to sort of obsess over that code, but the way I thought about it was almost it does feel like often when we talk about genderless clothes, it does mean making women look like men rather than making men look like women. And I think she probably has the commercial nous to be like, oh, if I make all my men look like women, it won't sell. But then I think she does realise that it doesn't seem that forward thinking to just make all your girls look boyish. So I thought that's why, to me, it felt relatively progressive to keep them separate, even though they were in skirts, which is relatively conservative. But it's interesting that I think Mrs. Prada's one of those designers where whatever she does, you obsess over it and you think about it more than you would if, say, anyone else did it. But who, other than Miss Prada, who are the kind of the genderless fashion leaders, or who's played with gender in a really successful way? I'm thinking also, just because I know you guys had the amazing Italian fashion exhibition, when you were going through that, were there people who played with it sort of before her?
I think that Prada is really unique in Milan for daring to be a little bit subversive, because the Italians in general don't have an appetite for subversion. And before Prada, it might have been someone like Moschino when he was alive. But I don't think, that's my view, I don't know if anyone disagrees, but...
I suppose Armani, early on, the women with the cropped boyish hair in the 80s, and maybe this kind of softer androgyny and the big suits and things, but not in such a subversive approach.
Well, that's true, actually. Those, if you think about the working women's wardrobe and how the Armani suit became the uniform, that's probably a good comparison.
Well, it's Gautier very much in the 80s, who was very much, questioning gender way ahead of everyone else. I thought he was a massively important influence. I was working at the Independent, and early in my career, I mean, we did an April Fool's page where I went to Savile Row and persuaded one of the tailors to get in on the act, and we mocked up this new range of beautifully tailored Savile Row skirts for men. And we shot it, and it was a great April Fool. It was a wonderful one. I don't know if anyone fell for it.
That wouldn't feel like a joke anymore. I think
Well, exactly, at the time, it was...
What were the skirts like? Were they very sort of kilty, or were they...
Yeah, they were actually, yes. They weren't great masterpieces of creation.
You didn't do a puff.
It was black and white photography.
like pencil
and you had
skirts.
colour photos in the paper in those days.
But interestingly, Andrew Bolton, when he was at the V&A over a decade ago, he had an exhibition on men in skirts. And that's interesting to look back on and actually see in the 90s that there were quite a lot of designers who were looking at that.
They were doing that, yes, and I think Gautier was the one who was really pushing it, but it was picked up by quite a lot of the young London club crowd, I think. It wasn't an unusual sight, and that was a wonderful period.
Well, I think it's quite interesting at the moment is I think J.W. Anderson is kind of the obvious one, and he's done it in such an interesting way, but I think there are some young designers who play with gender in a really interesting way, but perhaps don't blur the gender line so much. So a good example is Astrid Anderson, whose man, is quite macho and bulky, and the way she styles him, it's, he's not a kind of, foppish dandy. But she really plays with gender. She uses things like lace, and she'll use very delicate fabrics. And I think that's really interesting to see even that conversation about gender, which actually goes back to what you were saying, William, about it being kind of in the air and socially kind of relevant. Is it informing designers who aren't working to a market where they're necessarily, foppish and dandyish, as I said?
I also think with Astrid, I think that's kind of almost about making a statement. She's making that contrast. Her boys are super built, and they're very boyish, and they look like they've literally walked out of the gym, and yet she's kind of putting them in lace. And I think it's kind of they're probably not the pieces which end up in stores or end up being bought from a store, but it's kind of in there as an icon of what she's actually trying to say.
Yeah, no, I think that's interesting. You're probably right with that. Let's talk a bit more about Mrs. Prada and her attitude to gender. Does this feel like a new thing? Because it's interesting what you say when you interviewed her, because looking back through the Prada archive, I don't think she's someone who's tirelessly sort of played with gender.
I do think that she's evolved, that she's moved on, and she once referred to her lines, the womenswear, menswear, and Miu Miu as the triangle.
Yeah.
And that's a kind of nice image because all the points are connected, but they're kind of distinct, the sides of the triangle. But I think that it seems that she's let go of that a little bit, of them being so distinct. I think she's allowed herself, especially, as you pointed out, this manifesto that appeared out of nowhere for the first time.
Why do you think she did show notes? I know no one knows.
Well, I mean, the manifesto. I mean, I've only you were there, I think, Lou. I wasn't there, but I've just read it quite recently. I mean, there's a lot of questions in it, so it's not a manifesto suggests she's making a bold statement, but she's throwing out as many questions as answers, isn't she? And that's what she often likes to do. You sometimes wonder, whether she's got the questions. She doesn't necessarily have the answers, although all the journalists believe she does.
Yeah.
But I think that is where you get the sort of common thread with Prada. Like, even if gender hasn't been something that she's consistently been interested in, she is always asking questions. There's always a concept, and there are always questions around that concept that sort of seem to form the kernel of each collection.
Yeah, you're right. She starts conversations with her design, which I thought...
Which is wonderful.
Yeah, exactly.
And I mean, one gets it less later in her career, but certainly in a lot of the early interviews she was almost questioning, what am I doing in fashion?
Yeah, exactly.
That kind of sense of questioning herself non-stop and trying to justify to herself, not to anyone else, because we all knew that she was a natural, but why am I doing this? And it's the questioning nature of her work that's so exciting, isn't it?
And I think too the fact that she has this other world with the contemporary art world that she cares so passionately about, and has said, in some ways fashion is just a vehicle for me to do what I really love, and so I always wonder, how does she manage to produce what she does in the catwalk, which takes so much care and thought, when actually it's like she's got this other lover inside, which is her real love.
But I think what's interesting with hers, I do think that they very successfully use the fact that everyone will pay so much attention to what they do and will kind of consider it and question it in a way that they wouldn't for other people. And real cynics would look at this collection and say that, given Prada's recent figures, this was a very safe collection. I think it was Charlie Porter that wrote in his review, it was almost a collection of things that you'd want to buy if you just went into a Prada store like tomorrow. So real cynics would say that this whole manifesto and the conversation of gender was to give something to jazz up a collection which was kind of Prada staples. But maybe that's us being very unfair. I didn't think that. I went mad for the gender thing.
I think she's brilliant. I think they really have built an amazingly brilliant global brand.
Yeah.
And she continues to be able to be at the helm of that and push that forwards in however she sees fit. And I think the fact that she loves art really kind of fulfills that almost, because she has a really good understanding of not just making clothes, but also using something aesthetic to kind of put a message forwards.
Yeah.
And I think the whole thing comes together as one product, which is interesting that she's putting men and women on the catwalk at the same time. For that reason alone, it's kind of building this world around her, which she's absolutely fantastic at.
I think that's a wonderful analogy of the kind of the whole world, because it's also obviously her interest in fine art informs what she does on the catwalk and how it's marketed, working with fashion filmmakers and with illustrators and this whole kind of network of creatives, that it's not just about the clothes, it's about this other way of expressing the collection.
Well, the day after they did this show, they had an event which was all to do with the Prada Journal, where they got all the actors that are in their current campaign to kind of do these readings by interesting writers, and it did feel very much like, and you were invited back to the show space, which was kept in the way that it was here, and kind of you could mill through it, and it almost felt like you were kind of like you'd gone on a Prada package holiday where you saw the show and then the next day you were at the event and you got to kind of really live the Prada world. which is really interesting.
It sounds like it was really successful.
Yeah, it was great.
Strategy.
It was really, really successful. And I think, frankly, it was nice actually just to go back and kind of like almost relive the show, even though obviously the fashion wasn't there again, just walking through the show space. And I think they're just very good at owning Milan Fashion Week and kind of really establishing, not in the way that Armani does, where everywhere you look it's like Armani Hotel, Armani this, Armani, but just kind of making, kind of flexing their intellectual muscle. I think they're very good at doing.
And leaving breadcrumbs, I think, as well, which is
Yeah.
one kind of what I was trying to get to a minute ago. I couldn't actually get out, but you know, it's kind of there's lots about her and about the brand that you know and you kind of talk about that has nothing to do with the clothes.
Yeah.
You know, people talk about the fact that only silver cars are allowed in the car park, or you know, she has the kind of the
Her
slide that goes from her office to her car. And, you know, those things add so much to the brand, you know, and add so much to her kind of world, I think.
And I think it's perfectly reasonable, looking at the business situation for them, that they do play it a bit safe with the clothes at the moment. I mean, this is a company that is invested massively in these huge flagship stores, whilst most of the other luxury brands in the last 2 years have cut back drastically on that.
Well, that kind of does lead us to the next topic, which I want to discuss, which is, you know, it's related to China, but we can start with a kind of more general discussion, which is, you know, Prada haven't had the most, you know, they haven't had terrible sales figures, but they've had some kind of, you know, problems which they've cited as stemming from the kind of unsure luxury market in China. What's your take on that?
I mean, Prada's business story is a very interesting case study, and it's not covered in glory. I mean, the 4 or 5 times they cancelled their IPO, their efforts to make other brands such as Jill Sander or Helmut Lang turn into global brands. You know, there's a lot of not great stories there.
Yeah.
But the creative energy has never been in doubt. And in a way, it's wonderful. I think that they've continued to do their own thing, but I think they clearly need to retrench a little bit. But everyone's having problems in China.
And what do you think the root of that is? Because there's been some really interesting think pieces about. You know, I think it's quite an obvious thing that just this logo mania that high fashion and luxury brands rely on in China is.
There are two main reasons. I think one is this fundamental thing that the Chinese actually don't actually buy their designer labels in China because the taxes are so high, so they get out of the country and they come over here to Europe, and so they're not actually buying the sensible ones who spend a lot aren't buying a lot in China anyway. And then there's also the whole culture at the moment, which is from government downwards, anti ostentatious displays of consumption, and China had thrived on that, or the Chinese luxury sector had thrived on that for 10 years or so. And now, even if you've gained your money by completely fair means, you don't want to flaunt it too much, because that is a way to being inspected by the government. So watches are out, flashy jewellery, extravagance has to be done in a much more subtle way, which isn't great news for the luxury sector worldwide.
But then, do you not think, in a way, yes, it's not great news, but then it just means they're going to have to transfer similar strategies that they put in place for Europe to China? You know, we see a lot of brands focusing much more on fabrication and craft over here, so it'll just need, I guess it's a lot easier sale.
In the work that the website stylist that I work on, we've looked a lot at the changing Chinese consumer in the last few years, and there is no doubt that in the big cities, and I'm particularly thinking of a place like Shanghai or Beijing, Nanjing, some of the secondary cities, that there is a more sophisticated, can we use that word? Kind of customer who's not so logo obsessed, who wants something a bit more subtle, who's not happy just to be palmed off with what didn't sell in Europe by the luxury stores. And so there was anyway a kind of move towards that, which was great, you know, a sort of maturing of the luxury design and fashion market in China, which I think was challenging European and Western labels to up their game and respond, which is great.
And there also might be something in the fact that the Chinese landscape for fashion is also starting to produce legitimate competition for Western
really good point.
brands, and so there's got to be that part of the equation also.
Yeah, I think to add, to that with the cultural changes you were talking about, I think the Chinese government is investing very heavily at the moment in design, and we're working on some projects over there, and it's very interesting to see how that landscape is changing, and that, there is this kind of appreciation for design, and as Sonnet said, a lot of design is just coming to the fore now in China. So.
And it's across the board, not just fashion design, but trying to put efforts towards funding education programs to create a new generation of designers that can create stuff for Chinese consumers in China.
So have luxury brands, the European luxury brands, have they been quite short-sighted, do we think, in the strategies that they've had?
Well, interestingly, I read that on a Bloomberg report that Prada is trying to address this. One of the things that they're trying to do is to produce a line of accessories that are lower priced. So, bringing the bag price down to around £2,000, say, to provide a more affordable, less ostentatious accessory. And of course, the accessories are Prada's secret weapon. It's the key driver of sales volume. So that could be a clever strategy, but that's just one tiny component of a very complex business.
I mean, the brand that's been really long term is Hermes, with the Shangxia Chinese brand that they set up more than 10 years ago, which is the ultimate definition of a quiet luxury. So understated, it's not true. It's not just fashion; it's furniture and porcelain, and it's beautifully done. And it hasn't. Hermes right at the beginning said this is a very long-term commitment, and I think we're all a bit cynical about it. They'll close that in 2 years, but actually it hasn't achieved any great volumes and probably doesn't make any serious contribution to the bottom line of Hermes at all. But they've stuck with it, and they're gradually opening.
Why do you think they've stuck with it? Do you think they think it will?
Because I remember hearing, I can't remember the chairman or chief executive of Hermes talking at a conference, and he was saying that, Hermes over the decades in the 20th century looked to China for inspiration, and we had a long-term design interest in China, and we want to have a long-term creative relationship with China. Which sounded fantastic, and it's just great, 10 years on, that they have stuck with it, and the more long-term thinking is really special, which to give Prada their benefit, despite maybe their occasional business missteps in creative terms, their commitments to the contemporary arts, in a company driven by the bottom line, a lot of those projects would be straight out, wouldn't they?
Yeah, they have done some amazing. They would
stuck
do the
with
thing in
it,
Florence with the restoration of kind of, everything from kind of really old artworks right through to, they were doing like a Jackson Pollock there at the Last Pity, and they let you come in and see that, and that's really an amazing story. But is that what we need to see more of? In these brands, the way they're dealing with China. It's really interesting you talked about Hermes with this idea of a creative collaboration, a creative conversation with the Chinese, because it does feel in some ways like the way luxury brands have approached China, as you say, is very much kind of like ship in some product and try and sell it.
Yeah, they realise that they can't get away with that anymore. Yeah. And in fact, Shangxia is designed by a Chinese person, so it's not a French take on Chineseness. It's a Chinese brand, just happens to be financed by them, which is very special, and it's a bit disappointing in a way that more Western brands haven't done that, and perhaps we'll see that in the future.
I think it's quite hard for some brands to be able to do that though. The brand itself you have to expect that from it. Otherwise it's not taken in any sort of serious context.
Yeah, no, you're actually really right with that. But it's interesting, isn't it, just to think about it with, sorry, I keep picking on you, Richard, but just to think about it in terms of education, because, especially now with our visa policies towards foreign students, we are going to see more people coming and studying at paces like in Europe, but then actually going home and taking previously we'd keep them here, and then that's why we'd have great design in London, but we're going to see more and more.
I've only think one or two Chinese students, whether designers or journalists, who've been able to stay in the UK anyway. So most of them are going back. And I mean, it's great going to Beijing now. It's like, you call up Vogue or Harper's there, and it's like a Central St. Martin's reunion. I mean, it's great, but they're coming back, and they're beginning to do their own thing, the designers as well as the photographers and the stylists and the journalists.
Are we not going to get to a point where they're not, why would they even come and study here? Are we not going to have, going back to what you were saying about kind of investing in the arts, are we not going to see brilliant education opportunities out there?
Well, there have been lots of efforts.
Yeah.
I remember going to one of the colleges that was set up with private money in Beijing, and it was just the biggest campus I'd ever seen. It lasted about a year. It was just a complete white elephant.
Yeah.
But there have been lots of big projects like that. But there's still a real conservatism in teaching circles, which Hong Kong has tried hard, had lots of conversations with senior people at St Martin's over the years about trying to do something with the Hong Kong Polytechnic, but it's never really come to anything. Maybe it will one day.
I'm just curious that it sounds like this is an area I don't really know much about, but that there's no viable fashion training that you're aware of there. Is that harsh?
That would probably be a bit harsh, but I mean, there's still quite a lot of fashion design courses that appear to be run largely by art teachers who spend the first year teaching their students to draw. So the design comes in all a bit late.
Yeah.
I mean, as I say, I'm not an expert. I mean, they're hundreds and thousands, and there's a rumor that Condé Nast will open a college in Shanghai in the near future as well. So it may be that British colleges start to. There are some developments already. Some British colleges that are opening offshoots in China, and it may be through some kind of joint venture collaborations that something can be achieved.
I think that point about it being British colleges or American colleges going over is kind of key though as well, rather than it being institutes formed from China. And I wonder if that's because in the same way that their kind of contemporary art world is only very, very small in its kind of history, because the doors have only been open for 50 or 60 years.
Yeah.
Well, it's also the fact that museums as well Oriole and I were talking about this earlier, the fact that the V&A is opening a kind of branch, well that's a bit strong, where we have a gallery that's opening in Shenzhen within the design museum there, and for a 5-year period we're going to be filling that gallery with V&A content. And so it's a temporary arrangement to have a V&A outpost, but it's just this sense that everyone feels that they need to engage somehow geographically, intellectually with what's going on there. And even though the luxury market sales have waned in the last 24 months, that doesn't seem to have affected a lot of decisions that people are making about how to do business.
I think it's so smart that you mentioned that, because it depends what you see as kind of success for fashion in China. Yes, everyone's saying it's a difficult time for fashion in China because of the slowing luxury sales, but then you think that actually those slowing luxury sales, if that means a more kind of informed, intelligent Chinese shopper, that can mean all sorts of things, as you say, things like increased interest in younger brands or increased interest in fashion exhibiting, or and I think that's really interesting. It's like what you measure the success of fashion by. I say this as I think the show is starting. But so Amber, what were you
I think it's kind of working both ways to a degree in terms of sort of museums and galleries at the moment as well, because we're seeing a lot of exhibitions in the West that are focusing on Chinese design. Obviously there's a big one opening at the Met, but even like at the British Museum with the Ming exhibition they just had. And there was the Chinese imperial robes a few years ago, I think, at the V&A as well. So you're seeing a lot of that kind of soft power being displayed, I think, over here as well, which is quite interesting if you're thinking about it in those kinds of terms of cultural content, I guess.
I think it is interesting in general as well, the way we talk about, particularly like, Asia as a whole, not specifically China, because we often talk about these kind of conservative shoppers and the logo mania, but the flip side of that is if you talk to any like really young brand, I mean kind of like people like, I don't know, like Craig Green or Sibling, a lot of those really young London brands, they're supported mainly through like stores like Joyce and stuff that are in Asia. It's not so much London stores, we're slightly more conservative, and I think there's that interesting real sort of two ends of the spectrum there. But even if you just look at, I don't think it's not necessarily because of that, but if you look at a lot of the designs we see here, going back to Astrid as an example, but also Craig as an example, they really do reflect kind of Asian design, particularly someone like Craig, and you can relate that to someone like the influence of Yohji Yamamoto, but I do think it's a kind of a general
I think we have some.
We've got the shade. Thanks, Brit. Can we have it a bit bigger? Oh, thanks. You're doing music.
The stronger being for that mystery.
Speaking of gender, the first look is trousers.
Yeah. And it's interesting also just she kept the show space but completely changed it in some ways. So the Prada show space is always in the same venue, as I'm sure most of you know, and they change it up each season and do really interesting things. And for the men's, they split it into these rooms, which are exactly identical to as you're seeing, but it was very kind of quite brutal, like lots of, it almost looked like marble, what they'd done, and then this iron on the floor, and now that sort of metal is still there, but it's all pastel, which is incredibly feminine. It's like saccharinely feminine.
So you can see that she's definitely trying to make that strong contrast with the muted palette of the menswear.
Yeah.
We're going straight into colour in a big way.
Punchy,
And the fact that they're all wearing trousers, so the first few looks get those little quite male suits after the dresses, isn't
But then to do them in these kind of like 50s colours,
Yeah.
it's quite. But you're right, it's a very male outfit, even just like that right buttoned high collar.
it? Yeah, that there is a continuity from the sort of.
It's quite Miu Miu-y, which is interesting.
Yeah.
The palette, even like the accessories, they look very schoolgirly. Looks like they're in a marshmallow. I think if I was there, I'd make me feel quite sick. It's really not what I was expecting, but I think that's what makes it. I thought she was going to do an extension of the.
It's just the power of colour, isn't it? In the last year I've been working a bit with Pantone, who I've never worked with before, and it's just made me look at fashion so often now through colour. I'm thinking colours all the time, and it's just the power of it, and this is a colour story so far, isn't it?
I think it's been quite like that this season though. I think
Yes.
a lot of the strongest collections have been ones where the colour has been really brilliant. I think Christopher Kane, the reason it was such a great collection was the amazing use of colour.
Yes.
And I wonder if that, to think big, I wonder if that has something to do with how we view collections and things like e-retail, but also online catwalk imagery. If it's making designers think more and more and more about colour and like the subtleties of colour.
Yes. And we see herringbone and sort of traditional men's fabrics being reworked. We see double-breasted as a very strong theme throughout already. Particularly, a lot of women's wear designers have been taking these traditional British tweedy checks and herringbones and making them fresh, either through colour or through much softer fabrications.
And it looks like the additions on the collars, it's kind of that leather patchwork.
Yes.
Typically maybe on the elbow jackets of a man's coat, but now it's kind of round collars, and that's an interesting, those applique details are quite fun.
It's very interesting, isn't it? Because it contradicts, which is what she does, and what she does so brilliantly. Everything I was saying right at the start about keeping men's and women's wardrobes distinct, this collection feels like literally an exercise in merging men's and women's. It's about
We haven't seen a single skirt
it's
or dress.
As we say, it's all like men's silhouettes, men's fabrics. We'll say that as we get our skirts.
Yeah.
She loves to contradict. But it is about kind of marrying men's and women's, which is exactly a contradiction. But maybe this is part of, going back to the show notes she gave at the men's. Maybe that wasn't just a show notes for the men's, it was a statement of intent for a few seasons to come, because she does talk about, all these questions. She said, freedom to interpretation, references of ideas. These shows are she does say these shows, she doesn't say this show, she says these shows are the perfect moment to analyse the subject more deeply, to measure what the genders share, what they can take from each other. So it does feel like that was a kind of,
It's not
last
clear.
season was a starting point.
These fragments scattered across these dresses are really beautiful. I can't really work out whether is it applique or is it a print on top of
It
it?
looks like it's applique, like a leather kind of lattice.
It almost, on the ones on the collar, it almost looks like it almost looks like that could be a brooch. It doesn't even look like
they do look like acrylic brooches.
they do, yeah.
But even though it's the clothes, the components, the trousers, the jackets are very mannish, the color palette is very feminine and saccharine, as you say. But also there is a primness about it, which is very Prada. There's a kind of ladylike element that's just so it's so exactly what you would expect.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting, you know, the especially given what she did kind of last season and even actually kind of the season before that, this conversation that she's been having about kind of appropriateness and what is, you know, what is suitable to wear when, and it almost ties into notions of kind of like manners and tradition, and I think that's coming through still in this.
But she does always love to subvert those. There's always that traditional element that she kind of mixes up, and I quite like the sort of fascistic gloves on this. It's, you know, there's just a little bit off. It's quite strange.
And this is dressy, and as you say, I mean, I think there seems to be a feeling within the designs I've been speaking to that by spring, summer 16, that the sportswear thing will have run its path, and that we'll see this return to a more dressy, traditional lady, like the bag, the right belt, the look, the whole look.
But I think that's interesting, isn't it? Because I think within certain audiences, you know, there's an audience for whom sportswear is like how they were always dressed, it's how they've always dressed. It to them, it's they have stratas of formal and informal within sportswear. But I think you're right, the way sportswear was worn by some as a trend, and I think that's really interesting.
Yeah, I'm talking about it from a directional trend. I think in the mass market, sportswear will be here and develop for years to come.
Yeah.
It's interesting that, I mean, even with the more sort of masculine looks, all of the footwear is actually quite feminine.
Yeah.
And she's kind of maintained that through all of the shoes. I mean, I was kind of thinking it, and all of a sudden it became a bit more boyish again. But you know, the colouring and the kind of the really bright soles on there.
They're less ugly than usual. You know, she's very good at doing really clumpy shoes. Whereas there's I know they have the kind of a chunkier sole, but they are slightly more kind of pretty.
The earlier ones on the first few looks were like super feminine.
Yeah, very dainty.
Yeah,
exactly like what
it's
you're
like
saying
these.
there,
Yeah.
No, the gloves are a big story, aren't they? And accessories, long or short.
I do think it's very, very, very youthful, which is interesting. And maybe it's something to do with the casting, but I think if you saw images of this, you would say it was a Miu Miu show, which is interesting because I think she's done a really, you know, it's exactly actually what you were saying before, which is, you know, we said how she saw them as a triangle, and she feels like she's blurred the men and the women's, and now she's kind of blurring all three into one, and that's really interesting.
There's a kind of porousness between the collections.
Yeah, because Miu Miu isn't really a diffusion line, especially definitely not in price point. So you think it's interesting that they do become part of this.
Yeah, I think originally Miu Miu was more girlish, and this is completely. So girlish.
These are the epaulettes, aren't they? These are the male uniform epaulettes reworked as a sort of furry
shoulder
pads.
I've kind of got this idea. I wonder whether or not, when you're saying about kind of bringing Miu Miu up and I wonder if there is an idea where she's going to kind of roll everything under one umbrella.
Yeah.
You know, I kind of feel almost like the mixture between what we've seen here and what we saw with the menswear and the men and the women, and then kind of whether or not Miu Miu's are, you know, I'm not going to say whether or not it's relevant, but you know, how that kind of fits into the whole picture.
How it fits in, exactly, because it would be very strange to have this huge conversation going on about gender within, you know, Prada men's and Prada women's, and then Miu Miu just kind of continues as normal.
Yeah,
but there have been loads of rumours about the return of Miu Miu men's, which would be the best thing ever.
I'd still look for that stuff on eBay.
Good.
Like,
it's so good. But can you imagine? It would be so great.
Commercially, it'd be very savvy as well, actually.
Yeah.
There's everything that we've seen so far is very viable. It's very appealing.
Yeah.
It has you can just see the stuff flying off the shelves.
Which you could with the menswear as well.
Yeah, but in a very different way, which I think is what's really, really smart. It's almost like she's offered that, and that could sit alongside this. If you go and you just want your typical kind of great black coat or your black party dress, you can buy that, or you can buy, you know.
I was thinking, just about the idea of when you look at something and you know immediately that it's Prada. You know how sometimes you can look at a collection and it could have been, you know, one designer, it could have been another, and it's almost like she's removing the idea of the use of a logo or the use of a kind of immediate icon, and just kind of saying, well, no, my vision is so strong.
But then what's interesting is I always feel like what makes you know a collection is Prada is the palette, and it tends to be the kind of moodier colours that make me think that, like the burgundies and the kind of ugly, like the use of brown, whereas she hasn't done that at all here. You know, this is it's not a Prada palette. I don't think it's a Miu Miu palette, which is interesting.
You'd still know though if you saw it on the street. You'd still immediately know, you know, the cut and the shape and the fabrics as well. Sorry.
That's all right. I was just going to say it's so accessories heavy as well. Like even the gloves being such a big story, actually seems like quite a canny commercial move. Because you can see people, especially the shorter ones that may be more wearable, you can see those being huge commercially.
And people do just want to buy, like I think the market for like luxury knickknacks has never been more strong. You know, like the iPhone cases and the key rings and like all these Fendi pom-poms, exactly, you know.
And we've got a lot of embroidery and interesting details, embellishment here, and quite a lot of companies at the moment trying to develop their departments in that respect to stand out from the crowd and develop expertise in-house in that, almost in a kind of couture way, and little areas that they can really make special and make different.
Yeah, it's interesting as well, because that is also something that I think feels very Prada. She's very good with big gems and embellishments, and I think it feels like another part of the Prada history and a Prada code. I do think it's interesting also just to think about, you know, we often, when we look at Milan Fashion Week on these panels, talk about the way that the Milanese designers or the Italian designers are taking influence from what's happening in London. You never tend to do that with Prada because, you know, she's such a leader. But I do think if you think about the aesthetic that a lot of the newer brands are pushing, people like Simone Rocha, Sibling, particularly people like, you know, Medium Kirchhoff and Ryan Lowe, there's a real focus on girlishness and primness and embellishments and tutu. You know, that is a real, like even people like Sophia Webster on the accessories, you know, that feels like a very, I think that's a thread that ties them all together, and it's interesting that that's what she's doing as well, because it does feel very of the moment. So I'm not saying she's kind of looked and copied that, but then I think it's interesting that that's a big story that's happening amongst younger designers.
I wonder about Instagram as well, you know, and social media and where that kind of plays into it. And I think with that sort of super femininity and kind of the idea of little knickknacks and all that kind of thing, it's about selling through what you can snap. And
it's like Tumblr girls, Instagram girls, you know, it feels so...
The set design here is completely the colour palette, isn't it? It's absolutely writ large. There they go.
It does recall the little satin pouch bags of the 90s, and that sort of Prada sort of early.
And I just like the kind of empire lines. It's quite odd, you know. It's off.
I like the evening trouser ensembles as well. That's a nice touch.
Yeah. And I like her version of the flare. You know, everyone's doing flares, and then hers are kind of really weird and cropped, and it's great.
It's a truly pretty collection, isn't it? In the nicest sense of that word.
Yeah.
It really is.
But then it's interesting to think, you know, what happened at the couture most recently, you know, like, you know, Chanel, that was such a pretty collection. It was like all pinks and florals, and I do think there's this notion of prettiness, but not necessarily done in a safe way, like done in a quite a conceptual way, which is quite interesting.
She's obviously having fun with us, the audience, though, after the dark palette.
I know everyone
determined to now surprise us again. So,
but I do think it's very interesting. It's kind of like, you know, she spoke so sort of like firmly, and everyone's like, oh, you know, Prada, this huge statement on gender, and then just do a collection that kind of makes women look like these very sort of prim little housewives, very pretty. Like it's just the classic Prada wit, isn't it? Because it was interesting, you know, she kind of did kid us when it started. We were like, oh, it's, you know, very masculine shapes, but actually when you see it as a whole collection, it's very kind of very feminine. But that's hers, that she like lulls you into a false sense of security, and then
it surprises you.
You can imagine journalists really needing to file, starting their reviews, being like, oh, she's done masculine shapes and feminine fabrics, and having to rewrite it halfway through the collection. I want to see what she's wearing.
It's interesting.
Oh, she's all in black.
She comes.
She's so fabulous. So are we impressed? Do we like what we've seen?
Oh yes. I think it's very Prada, but it's also very appealing, widely appealing, saleable.
Yeah, it's very clever. I think colour palette and the use of the applique and all that kind of thing. I think it's nice.
I think it's so smart what you said about, you kind of halfway through you just said, thinking about Instagram. And I do think, last season, the men's, but that's interesting. I keep saying last season because, it felt like such a womenswear collection. The men's, it was it kind of led to so many words and it kicked off so much conversation and coverage and articles, and then it feels like she's done the opposite with this season. She's just you couldn't really Instagram anything from last season. It was all about conversations and about analysis, whereas this season it's pure fodder for social media. Like you can do close-ups of all these little things and the colours and the palette, whereas with all that nylon and all that black last time, you couldn't really, there was not much for that audience, whereas this has kind of gone in completely different
She's
direction.
appropriated lots of menswear ideas but made every single one of them thoroughly ladylike.
Yeah.
There's nothing traditional menswear about them anymore.
I really love the colour palette and the way that it's the sort of jackets and ties and collars is all such, you wouldn't think to put them together, but once they are together they work so well.
That's true. There's a nice contrast in the colours of those different components, so that you notice them more, and that they somehow, like the shirts, the collars are different from and it all just somehow works, even though the colours are a bit, you wouldn't think to put them together necessarily.
No, I think that's true.
Pink and chartreuse in that middle one there.
What do you think the fabric is on those jackets, on the double breast?
It's like a neoprene, isn't it?
I think it is.
I don't think it is neoprene. I think
It's certainly a neoprene look, isn't it?
Yeah.
Whether it is or not. And there also those shiny, which could have been anything from treated leather to pleather to who knows what, and how to get close up.
But I think what's interesting is, when you saw it at the end, Roger, you said it's a decidedly pretty collection, but there is that kind of, signature Prada, as you say, with the palette, the signature Prada ugliness. When you look at it, where it doesn't quite work, all the very, very odd mixes of colours, it keeps it from feeling too kind of, it's inviting, but it's not obvious, and I think that's what's interesting.
Yes, I think you're right that the palette, if you just saw it on a page as a palette, it would look fine. But then she just slightly puts it together in ways that are a bit off kilter all the time. And so it's very Prada-esque kind of ways, which, as you say, aren't predictable.
And it's those kinds of elements, and having maybe a slightly off hemline for the flares and stuff, that stop it from becoming twee as well.
Yeah.
Because we're talking a lot about elements that make it very feminine or elements that are slightly masculine. But if it was, she never really does twee. There's always something there that makes it a bit more interesting.
No, I think you're right. Looking at this, and as we kind of continue our analysis, I want to talk about the third point as well, which is, who could ever replace Mrs. Prada? Because it's something that you have to think about in some ways. It's kind of the same thing when you try and talk about it in relation to Comme des Garçons. It's not very fashionable to talk about it. People are kind of like, oh, that's pointless. But then there are, so many houses, if you think about it, where, you've got Karl Lagerfeld, Chanel, Mr. Armani, Rei Kawakubo, Mrs. Prada, so many houses. And I interviewed J.W. Anderson recently in his classic sort of punchy fashion. He was like, we were talking about who will replace people at the big houses, and he was like, but who is there? Seriously, who is there? And I kind of walked away and I was like, God, that's quite strong. But then I thought, actually, who is there? And it got me really, really thinking about who can go where. And
him.
But I think he's quite schooled in Prada, isn't he?
Well, he loves it, doesn't
exactly.
he? I mean,
and he works in
yeah.
visual
Less-
merchandising.
yeah.
And also I think when he first kind of became obsessed with fashion, it was the obsession with the kind of mishmash and the ugliness of Prada. So,
And, I often feel, all these great fashion houses have amazing teams. It's never just one person, is it? I mean, before Lee McQueen died, who had heard of Sarah Burton? And now, of course, we know that she was a core person for him for very many years. And I don't know Prada personally how the studio is constructed, but you can be sure that there are one or two people who are almost perfectly primed to pick up the mantle,
if you think about,
who we've never heard of.
Well, if you think that Rodolfo Pagliolunga, who was womenswear design director for 10 years, is now head of Jill Sander, it's not as if people think that there's a lack of talent on the Prada design team. Sorry, do you mind if we just go back to that bag? Because I thought that was really interesting. Just because, in a way that, in the context of that collection, that looks like quite an experimental bag, but in a way that's quite safe. And it's, pink, it will sell incredibly well to a certain audience. But it does remind me, you know, that it's like 1996 when they did that awful, ugly wallpaper collection, and it really reminds me of that. Like, 'cause that had the really bad greens in it,
and look how perfectly they've contrasted it with the suit. I mean, they've chosen exactly the right thing to accessorize it.
But it's that thing of, you know, like pink and green should never be seen, and then
voila,
pink and green.
I wonder if that herringbone is actually a tweed or whether it's a print. You know, the way sometimes she does those tweed prints on neoprene type finishes and stuff.
But that's what's interesting actually about things like 13 is when you look at them and you are not. I think that actually looking at it is a print, and then the brooch is. But then you don't know, do you, whether it's an applique?
Makes you want to go and look at your own wardrobe and start putting things together in very unexpected ways, isn't it? You know, even as a man, I feel that looking at this, you know, you begin to think, oh, why don't I ever put those together?
Yeah. But I think that's what's interesting about
being brave with colour, certainly.
Yeah, and I have this obsession with designers who do work where it doesn't seem to be about selling clothes, it seems to be about proposing things to try. That's why I always loved Medium Ketchup, because it never, you know, obviously there's an element where that you couldn't copy their pieces or emulate them by buying things off the high street, because they're so beautifully done. But I did seem to be an invitation to young girls to try and dress in a certain way, not an invitation to come and buy a load of Medium Ketchup, and I think that's really interesting. I do think though, if you see homages to this on the high street, they would be deeply, deeply unflattering and deeply ugly, because it's quite scary.
Well, it's you know, she's the only person who could pull that off, and she pulls it off brilliantly. But you know, I think it's, you know, the balance of colour and silhouette, and the textiles as well. I think that she just sort of nails it.
But do you not think it's one of those things, going back to what we talked about at the very start, it is that kind of thing where she gets away with it, but you wonder if another house, if they'd have done this, whether people would have just gone, oh,
it's this notion of the cult of the designer. We obviously are all, you know, fans, or, you know, we all think a certain way about her as a designer, and perhaps it's because she's proposing it that we accept it.
Yeah, no, I think you're totally right though. I wonder if sometimes she does have a laugh about it, and I kind of thought that last with the men's when it started coming out and it was just all black, and I was like, is she just sitting there going, you know, I'm just going to put out a load of black nylon and they'll still love it? And I mean,
but I suppose if you know her work and you know her approach, you know that she's drawn to the ugly. So you get yourself thinking in that way as well.
Yeah.
You know, you abandon your usual preconceptions. You try to see it through her eyes. And you know, when she first really had to go at lace, and it had to be anything but white lace. You know, it was just like sort of tearing up the rule books in every way. So. And
she likes making herself do things she hates. You know, that golf collection's a really famous example of that, where she hates golf.
She never does golf a day in her life,
and then she did a whole collection.
She just went for it.
Would you wonder if that's what this was? If, you know, maybe she was like, because it's not really how she dresses, and you wonder if she was like, hey, what don't I like about feminine dressing? Fine, I'll do that. You know.
She's a true fashion designer because she's excited by change and doing something different all the time. And she's said, you know, that the next day she's just straight away thinking about the next evolution or change or transformation or revolution or whatever. She really wants to make it move on. And that must be the driving force for any fashion designer, because if you don't have that, then how can you produce something different every 6 months?
And I do think sorry, William.
No, go on.
I was just going to say the thing that I always think is smartest, and I thought this a lot because there was an event at the Prada store during London Fashion Week, so I went and actually looked at all the stuff, and it was that collection with all the top stitching, the leather and the denim that they had on display, and actually, you know, on the runway that did feel really quite conceptual and, you know, really fashion, but actually when you saw it on a hanger, it looked like kind of like almost like old man clothes, like clothes, you know, if you saw someone wearing one of those leather jackets in the street, you would think that it was something they'd had for like 20 years, or perhaps had purchased somewhere quite unfashionable. And I kind of think it's a similar story with this collection, where it looks amazing when it's all styled, but actually, if you saw that blazer in a shop, that's a very conservative thing, and it can be worn in a very conservative way, and it can appeal to a kind of not anti-fashion, but someone who isn't interested in fashion, perhaps needs a nice skirt suit and can go to Prada and get one.
That's actually what I was just going to kind of say. No, so I was just going to say, like, with her, I mean, you were talking about colour, and really if you kind of just change the palette slightly, it wouldn't be fashion in the way that you were kind of describing it, in the way that collection was as well. It would actually be quite accessible, quite normal clothes for, you know, somebody who wasn't necessarily thinking about that.
Yeah, no, I think you're totally right, especially like there are so many skirt suits, and you think, you know, actually if you were a woman wanting some expensive clothes and you want an expensive skirt suit, you can go and get that as well. So do we think, just going back to the point of the next designer, do we think they'll promote from within? Is that what you'd put your money on, Roger?
Well, as I say, I don't know. I don't know the structure, but often the solution is from within, and in a way, I always think that's wonderful, because you know, what is the option? The alternative option is to bring in someone else who tries to kind of reinvent it. If the solution is within, I'm a big fan of that.
And if you look at what just happened at Gucci, you know, there seems to be real kind of acceptance of that, and people are excited by it equally as they would be if it was a star designer. What does everyone else think?
She's super respectful as well, in the sense that I think maybe she would do that to kind of promote somebody who's worked with her closely, and to respect them and to kind of honour them and their work, you know, rather than pulling somebody else in who would probably come in with a bit of a kind of like a bull in a china shop. You know?
Yeah, no, absolutely. What do you think, Amber?
Yeah, I agree. I don't think that Prada is really the kind of brand that would go for a name designer just for the sake of having a name designer there, because it's always so conceptual. That seems like a sort of too flashy a move in a way to get someone in that's, you know, that's maybe a big name that people have heard of. I think promoting from within seems like the most Prada choice.
And then it kind of does mean that Mrs. Prada would always be there then, because they've always worked with Mrs. Prada, so it's like that way of her kind of still showing even if she's not showing. So we're happy, we like what we've seen. Has it made us want to go and dress all prim? And I feel very kind of boring, I'm wearing very androgynous navy, and now I'm looking at that and I just want to go.
All the way through I kept wondering whether a man might suddenly appear,
Yeah,
so I was a bit disappointed in a way that she didn't do that.
She should have done that, shouldn't she?
Or a few men.
Yes.
Just to mix it up a bit. Like
Yes.
I mean, I love it. I just love how angry the male press get, you know, when they're at a menswear show and it's all women, and some of them they're like, I don't even look when there's a woman on the runway. They get really, really angry about it. They're like, it's our fashion week. Why are there women? They're just doing it to sell their women's wear. And I kind of love that she hasn't put any men on it. It's quite great.
Well, in the gender neutral world, all the menswear editors will be in the second row, won't they?
Yeah, exactly. Rightly so.
Yes.
Well, should we give her a big round of applause to wrap things up?
Yes.